Hey everyone, my name is Ryan Becker, and welcome to part 3 of my series on how to edit your podcast from start to finish. Part 1, we gave you just a quick introduction and overview of Adobe Audition and getting your files imported and set up. And then in part 2, we went over compression and noise reduction, getting rid of some of that background noise. And now in part 3, we're going to be looking at equalizing or EQing your vocals and your tracks, and then adding a noise gate and normalizing all of the volume so that all of your tracks are operating at about the exact same volume level. So one thing that you'll need is a good pair of headphones. Now, I would always recommend that you invest a little bit of money in a pair of studio headphones. Sony MDRs are amazing for this. What you want are headphones that are about as flat in their quality as possible. When I say flat, what I mean is this. If you were to buy a pair of Beats headphones and you listen to a file, then you're going to hear a lot more bass. If you buy a pair of Skull Candies, for some cheap Skull Candy earbuds, you're going to hear a little less. You're going to hear a lot less bass because cheaper headphones or earpods tend to lack in the low end. So when you're trying to balance your voice out, if you're missing, if you have headphones that emphasize one thing or don't emphasize enough, then you might overcompensate in your editing process so that you hear it fine in your ears. But then when someone else plays it on car headphones or car stereo or their headphones at home that are different, it's going to sound a lot different, and your bass may be overblown or your treble might be overblown or something to that effect. And so you want a good pair of headphones, but if you have what you have, then just make sure you know what your headphones are lacking in. That way you can compensate as you're editing and mentally kind of keep that in mind. So we're looking at just a quick 6.5 minute, the first part of one of my episodes for A Beautiful Faith. This track right here, this purple one, is me, and the one below it is my co-host. So we've just finished compressing the audio. We've just finished the noise reduction step that we did in part 2. So now we're getting ready to do some non-destructive editing and EQ in our multi-track view. So the first thing that we're going to do, and this is a preference thing, you don't have to do this. However, if your audio recorded in stereo and you only see your track or your waveform on one half of a track, then you'll need to do this step. So I'm going to show you how to do this step right off the bat. So what you're going to do is convert this stereo file to a mono file, so we're only looking at one waveform. So I'll double click it to open it in our waveform view. I'll right click and I'll go down to where it says extract channel in or two mono files. It's going to go ahead and extract those, and what you'll see pop up in your files panel is the same file, but then an L and an R after it. So the L means that that's the left side, the R means that's the right side. But both of these are now mono files. So to drop this in, I'll need to actually remove my current file and then replace it with either of the mono files that I so desire. This does mean that I'm going to have to quickly realign this up. Done. That's about where it was. And then I am good to continue editing. So the next thing we're going to do is match loudness. Now I do this before the editing process as a way of making sure that the average loudness across all of my files is the same. This is a really great tool that Adobe Audition has given us, and to access it, you can go to Window and then click Match Loudness. Now my Match Loudness is already open down here in this window. So, and if you open it for the first time, this will likely be your view. So you can either click Match Loudness Settings to bring up this little window, or just drag up this bar and you'll see it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to find the files that are in my multi-track view, and I'm going to select them by holding Control or Command, and I'll select both of them. And then I'm going to drag and drop the media files into the Match Loudness window. What Match Loudness is going to do is it's not going to match the files to each other. What it's actually going to do is it's going to raise or lower the average audio level of the entire track to a value that I set it at. Now the value measurement is LUFS. Do I know what that means? Nah. But this is kind of the industry standard for measuring average volume level or loudness. And I've heard industry standards, depending on who you're watching, you'll see negative 23, negative 24 dB, or LUFS, you'll see negative 19, or I've even seen negative 16 for music. Things have gotten louder over the years, and so the closer that number gets to 0, the louder it is. For podcasting, I like to do things about negative 19 dB. I like it to be a little bit loud because my listeners can always just turn it down a little bit versus I don't want them to have to turn it up a whole bunch. So the first thing it's going to do when you drop your files into the match loudness window is it's going to analyze them, and it's going to give you an average LUF rating for all of them. So negative 21 and negative 23. So Untitled 2, my Henry track, is actually quieter than my audio here. So what I'm going to do in our match loudness settings is I'm going to change the target loudness to negative 19. This is what I like to do. Have fun with it. However, what's really important is that max true peak level. This is the only other thing you're going to need to worry about. I always set this to negative 0.1 dB. That is as close to zero or as close to max loudness as you can get without it actually peaking and the audio starting to distort. So negative 0.1 is going to be where you want to be. From there, I'm simply going to hit run, and it's going to do its thing. It's going to analyze them, and it's going to adjust them. And you'll actually see a waveform change here. What you do in match loudness is destructive editing. So when I save this, these will now permanently be at the volume level that I've now set them to as soon as I save those files. Now that we have that out of the way, we're going to go ahead and start with EQing. So if you've never EQ'd anything, don't worry. You already probably have if you've ever ridden in a car and adjusted radio settings. If you've ever gone in and adjusted bass and mids and treble, well, that is EQ. Bass is those low frequency, those booms. Mids are those mid tones, and then highs are those highs where the s sounds are, the breathy sounds are, where cymbals and a drum crash are. Those are EQ settings, and it works very similarly in when you're EQing for podcasting. So we're going to go to our effects rack, and one big difference with our effects rack for EQing in multi-track view, anything we do in the effects rack in multi-track view will automatically apply as long as this little power symbol is green. So to deactivate a certain compressor or certain effect that you've added, you just turn it off, or you can actually remove it by right-clicking and remove selected effect. So you'll need to make sure that the right track is selected. You'll need to make sure the right track is selected. You'll know because this will be highlighted. You can edit. You can be looking at the wrong track and think you're editing, and you won't. So we'll make sure that we have the right track selected, and the first thing I'm going to go down to is filter and EQ, and I'm going to go to the parametric equalizer. I'm going to reset this to default. So let's walk you through this. What we're looking at is a standard equalizer graph, parametric equalizer graph. On the right, you have your dB levels. This is if I were to turn anything up, it would go up. These are, and then down is, below this line is turning it down. So this is a completely flat neutral. There's no adjustments being made to my file yet. Each one of these points is a point that I can change and manipulate. I can raise it in this frequency or lower it in this frequency. So this is where your bass, your basses, your lows. This is your mids all the way up to about 1.5. I would say about 300 to 1.2 is about your mids, or 1.5 is about your mids, and then everything else is your highs. So you're given 5 points to work with, in addition to a low and a high button, a high shelf and a low shelf. So the high shelf and the low shelf are simply, if I were to raise this, it raises the rest of the track, raises the rest of the frequencies past that point, and low would raise the rest of the frequencies below that, or lower them if I turn it down. So that's what a high shelf is. It literally creates a shelf out of the graph. So I'm going to reset that all to 0. And there's a rule that we tend to follow. The rule is this: when you're going to cut something, you cut it narrow, and when you're going to boost something, when you're going to turn it up, you boost wide. What does that mean? So let's say I take 0.3. Now, around 1.2K, or 1.2 kilohertz, that is where the nasal frequency tends to live. And I am using a microphone that also tends to amplify that a little bit, or highlight that part of the voice or that frequency a little bit more. And so what I like to do with my vocals when it comes to using this microphone is I like to turn down that area. But as I raise it or turn it down, you'll notice that it's actually affecting everything all the way up to almost 3,000 hertz and down almost to 500 hertz. And so that is cutting wide. So right down here where it says Q width, that is this 2 number that you see. If I raise that number, you'll see that it starts to get narrower. This is what it means when you say cut narrow. You want to cut out just a tiny sliver. You don't want to cut out more than you need. While boosting, you want to boost wide, because as you've boosted, you want there to be a smooth transition out of that to the rest of the frequencies in your track or in your mix. So you're going to cut narrow and boost wide as a frame of reference. And then the gain, this dB level, is how much I'm turning it up or down. Now let's say I know I'm recording in a perfectly square room, which is a terrible idea in general. And right around here in this 3 to 500 range, there's going to be what we call the boxy frequency. This is where it sounds like I'm talking in a box, and this amplifies it. So what I may want to do is turn that down a little bit. So I'm going to turn it down right about the 400 range. Typically, that's where I'm going to do, and I'm going to cut that. I'm going to cut that a little bit narrower about there. You don't need to make big sweeping changes here. However, there is a caveat here, and that's this. The human ear is actually terrible at catching minute changes to an audio file. So one of the things that I'll do is, I don't know if there's an official name for it, but I just call it the swing method, where I will, if I know that there's a change I want to make in a certain frequency or a certain range of frequencies, what I'll do is, let's say I want to boost this frequency, but I don't know how much I want to boost it. I will go dramatically up, and then I will bring it down a little bit less than what it was, to a little bit more than what I started with, and then I'll bring it up again a little bit less, and I will do that as that change gets smaller, and I'll eventually land where I want to be or where sounds good to me. If you are just moving it a tiny bit, you won't notice that change. You just won't. However, if you're doing big changes, you will notice that change. And so that I tend to swing until I find what I want. So we're looking at a perfectly, I've set everything back to default. We're looking at a perfectly flat parametric equalizer. Now, if I play my file, what you're going to see is you're actually going to be able to hear, this, this track as I edit. So as I add something or edit something, you'll actually be able to hear it live as I do it. That's the advantage to editing in multi-track view, is I can make fine, minute changes to something and hear it as it's happening, and see if that's something that I like or dislike. And I can keep going back and playing it over and over and over again. One thing that I do before I start everything is I will add a high-pass filter to my audio. So what a high-pass filter does is it says anything that is higher than this frequency, I'm going to allow through. A low pass, or LP, is going to be so over here in the bottom right, LP is low pass. That means anything above a certain frequency, I'm going to block out, and anything lower, I'm going to let pass through. So low pass and high pass. I like to set my high pass filter to start dropping at about 50 hertz. This is where a lot of the handling noise happens, a lot of low end rumble, and a lot of stuff that you just don't need. Getting rid of it isn't going to hurt your recording pretty much at all, unless you're recording something super, super, super low, super deep in its bass. So that's the first thing that I'm going to do typically to my tracks. So I'm going to go ahead and reset this to default. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you the edits that I do and then explain why I do them. So here we go. I'm going to play this and going to put on my headphones so that I can hear myself. And then we're going to edit this. So the first thing, we'll line up to a area where I talk for a while. There we go. We already talked for a while. And I'm going to mute Henry so that if there is, by clicking the solo on my track, so that's the only one I hear. That way, if it does overlap with him, I don't get thrown off by that. I'm only hearing my voice. So I'll go ahead and hit play.
I'm here at 8.
And right off the bat, you can see that it's actually playing. The waveform is visibly showing here. This is showing what areas in this frequency range are the most active as I am recording. So let's go ahead and go with my edits. In fact, I'm going to play from here.
Good. I've sabotaged your pun unintentionally.
unintentionally. This is the life. This is how I live by that. I live by unintentionally sabotaging the wonderful puns that others desire to make. I mean, the reason I do it is because I'm a cynic. No, look, you and I both are individuals that have, especially within the last couple of years, I would say, have had to wrestle with cynicism. All right. So I've done the live editing, as you've heard, and you also probably, if you have this turned up enough, you probably heard a little bit of Henry coming through, because as we were talking over Zoom, you heard his voice bleed through my headphones into my microphone. I'm going to show you how to get rid of that with a noise gate. That's especially effective if you're recording in the same room and you have what's called noise bleed. That's where one person talking into their microphone, their voice is loud enough that your microphone is picking it up as well. So I've gone ahead and made these changes. What I'm going to do is I'm actually going to save this as a preset by clicking that save icon, and I'm just going to save this to video editing preset just for a quick demonstration. And then what I'm going to do is reset this back to default, and I'm going to play this through, and then I'm going to play it again with the audio changes or with the graph changes that I've made. No, look, you and I both are individuals that have, especially within the last couple of years, I would say, have had to wrestle with cynicism. So this is a topic that really does, I think, All right. So there is a change there, and the idea here is that you're not trying to go overboard, unless like you literally are looking for a specific sound. What you're looking for is something that is just adding a little bit to your voice and removing anything that you don't like, but you don't want to go too far. For example, if I were to lower this 0.2 too much, then I would get a hollow sound. It would sound like I was talking in a tube where all you're hearing is the low end and the high end. It's hollow in the middle because I've cut all of that out. And so what I've done is, if you are someone who has a lot of bass in your voice, but you'd like to bring out a little bit more presence in the high end, then you would use a high shelf to do so. And typically if you're using a high shelf, for most voices, you won't need to do more than 2 or 3 dB of gain on that in order to raise it. I've raised it to 2.1. And then I've added a little bit of a bass kick after the high pass filter. I've added just a little bit more emphasis there on the low end. And then down, I've removed a little bit of that boxy sound, and I've reduced a little bit of that nasal frequency for myself as well. I tend to like how that sounds for me. I went straight to the settings because I already know them. Once you have what you like for your voice, save it as a preset with your name. That way you always know this is the preset I want to use for my voice, as long as I'm recording in the exact same situation. If I'm recording in the exact same room, in the exact same position. If you ever move your microphone or change your room or change anything about the way that noise carries in your room, you're going to need to change your EQ, because it's going to depend a lot on the environment that you record in, not just the quality of your voice. So now that that's done, I can exit out of that, and it's still there. There's no saving that. It's already there. When I save the session file, it will save my effects rack as well. Now, I'm going to need to do that for both of us. However, the next step that I'm going to do is a noise gate. So what we'll do is we'll go to number 2. Now, the noise gate in effects rack, if I put it as number 1, it will go first, and then the equalizer will come if I put an equalizer on 2. In other words, the effects rack is like layers if you're used to working in Photoshop, just the other way around. So what is on the bottom, the further down you go, or the higher in number you go, the later in the process that effect will apply to your track. So if you want something to apply at the end of all of the other things, after it's done all your other steps, then you need to put it last in your list. And if you want it to go first, which I like EQing to go first, because if I EQ and I'm turning something up or turning things down, it's actually going to change the volume of my track overall. And so it might make it a little bit quieter or a little bit louder, a tiny bit. So I like the noise gate to go last as my way of ensuring that there is no, that I don't let anything through. Because if I apply a noise gate and then turn everything up afterwards too much, it'll start allowing noise through that was quiet before, but now is louder than what I wanted. So when we talk about a noise gate, think of a noise gate as a gatekeeper that says anything quieter than this, I'm not going to allow in, and anything louder than this, I'm going to allow into the gates. So we'll go down to amplitude and compression, and we're going to select our dynamics tool again that we used for the compression, and we're going to avoid this entire 2/3 of this window, and we're only going to look at the auto gate. So I'll select auto gate, and then we've got our 4 settings that we are kind of used to by now. Threshold is the decibel level, or the volume level at which this gate will start to take effect. Then attack is how quickly it will attack as soon as it does pass the threshold. And then release is how quickly it lets off the gas. It stops gating audio. And then hold is how long it would kind of transition between the two. So for threshold, I like to set mine to -30, given that I'm working with louder audio files. If you're working with quieter ones, -30 might be too much for you. And then I like to have a very slow release. When I say slow, I'm talking 200, 208 milliseconds, somewhere around there. The reason for this is if I have too quick of a release time, then all of these little pauses where I'm still talking, but I've just taken a breath or ended a sentence, it's going to actually cut me off, and it's going to sound like my voice is pulsing in and out. If you've ever heard someone's voice pulsing in and out like that, then you will it's because they have too quick of a release or attack time on their files. What you want is a release that's long enough to allow something to be gated without it actually impacting your voice. It's a fine line between the two. If you hear your voice pulsing in and out, your noise gate is likely too aggressive. So you want it to cut out anything quieter than your voice, but not actually your voice itself. Things like, I crack my fingers a lot or take a breath. So I'm going to go ahead and move this over to here where there's a lot of pauses, and I'll show you what it looks like with a very quick release.
Good. I've sabotaged your pun unintentionally. This is the life. This is how I live by that. I live by unintentionally.
So my voice started to pulsate in and out on some keywords, and that's because as the human voice, inflects and rises and drops in volume, when you're ending a sentence, you tend to drop in volume, and so the end of your word might drop below that gate, below that threshold, and then the gate will cut you off. If I set a slower release time, right where I like it at about 208 or so, and replay this, it's going to sound a little bit more natural. It's going to allow a little bit more of the breaths to come into my file.
Good. I've sabotaged your pun unintentionally. This is the life. This is how I live by that. I live by unintentionally sabotaging the wonderful puns that others.
So it's brought back a little bit more humanity to my voice and gotten rid of a bit of that pulsing. And right here is where these 3 bars on the auto gate, this is where you can see if the gate is active. Red means that it's not letting something through. Green means that it is letting something through. So there, I've added the noise gate. The last thing that I like to do to my track is add a de-esser. The de-esser just softens the s sounds, those harsh sibilants that people tend to have. This softens it a little bit. I just use the default settings, and it's worked for me. Play around with it. The best thing you can do is play around with it, because this is non-destructive editing. Everything you're doing here is applying at a level above the file. It's not actually changing the file itself. So it's So you're safe. You're not going to ruin anything. Just make sure that if you find something you like and then want to keep experimenting, that you save or take a screenshot or do something with that, with what you like, so you can go back to it if, as you keep playing around, you find that you don't like what you've been doing. So now I've got both of my files. I'll need to do all of those steps for both of us. Luckily, there's a bunch of presets. I have a whole bunch that I've used myself that I've named for different situations. I'm going to go ahead and just give him a random one. Doesn't matter. And you'll notice that I actually had 2 other compressors that are a compressor and an equalizer that I was using in addition to this, but I disabled them and I no longer use them. And that's that. So that means that they're just not active. The only ones that are active are green. So now once I've done that, what I'm going to need to do is I'm actually going to need to let the file play through a little bit, because now I need to make sure that both of our voices are at about the same level. Match loudness did that on its own. However, as I've made EQ changes, it's probably shifted that a little bit, and one of us might be a little bit louder than the other. So here's the best thing to do. I'm going to go ahead and mute this on the computer side so that you don't hear this, but I'll still be able to hear it on my end. You're going to want the file to play through. And as it plays through, you're going to watch this levels window at the bottom. And what you want to make sure is that they are on average about at the same point. Now, one other thing that you could do is you could export each of these tracks by just selecting it, File, Export, and then multi-track mixdown. So File, Export, multi-track mixdown, and then selected clips, and select one at a time. And then it would export it, you'd name it, but then you would have to re-add it, re-drop it into your timeline. But that would be, and then you could match loudness. Once you've re-dropped it in, you could use the match loudness tool again, and it will apply everything and match loudness. That's one step to doing it. If you're using long files that are an hour long, the export process takes a couple minutes. So my suggestion is to do it this way, as it will save you some time. So you'll play the file, and you're just going to make sure that as I'm talking, I'm seeing that I'm sitting somewhere around -12, between -12 and -9 on average. Whereas if I play Henry's track, he's actually sitting a little bit louder than me, but on average, he's pretty, we're pretty close together. So what I might do is I might boost myself just a tad. I'll boost myself by 2 decibels there on average, so that when I play my file, now I'm a little bit closer on average to Henry's track. There, done. And now you have done all of your final editing. Now, one thing you'll do want to make sure is once you've done this step that you double check your noise gate by double clicking that dynamics button on both tracks. You'll need to check it on both tracks, and just make sure that it's still cutting out what you want it to cut out. If you raise your decibel level by 2, you'll likely need to raise your threshold by 2. That way everything just kind of stays consistent. So because I raised this by 2, I might raise my threshold by 2 decibels. And that way it just stays exactly the same. It's not changing anything. It's just getting rid of what I want it to get rid of. So that is EQing your voice. That is finding what you like with your voice. You can find more tutorials about this on YouTube, so go and look those up and just play around. The best thing you can do is record something and start playing around with an EQ until you find a sound that you like. So thank you guys so much for watching. Wait for part 3. Part 3 is going to be on adding your intro and outro music, balancing those, fading them in and out, and then exporting your final mix as one file that you can then upload to your host. So thank you guys so much for watching, and we'll see you next time.